The tremor in Frank's hand was a constant, a tiny earthquake that never ceased. It was the last rebellion of a body that had otherwise surrendered. His voice, once a parade ground bark that could command a platoon, was now a dry whisper, a rustle of leaves on pavement. "Nurse?" Maya turned from the window where the afternoon sun was turning the parking lot into a sea of shimmering asphalt. She moved to his bedside, her steps quiet on the polished linoleum of the hospice floor. His room was sterile, functional, a place designed for leaving the world, not living in it. The only personal touch was a faded photograph on his nightstand, a stiffly posed man in his 20s with Frank's jawline and a stranger's resentful eyes. His son, Mark, the son who hadn't visited in a decade. "I'm here, Frank," Maya said, her voice a soft anchor in the sterile silence. She adjusted his pillow, a small, practiced gesture of comfort. His eyes, milky with age and medication, found hers. They were filled with a raw, desperate clarity that cut through the haze of his illness. "I need a favor." The words were a struggle, each one costing him a visible measure of his dwindling energy. "Anything, Frank. You know that." He took a shallow, rattling breath. His trembling hand lifted an inch from the blanket, a gesture of supplication. "My boy, Mark, he's not coming." It wasn't a question. It was a verdict he had finally accepted. The photo on the nightstand seemed to mock him, a ghost of a relationship that had died long before Frank's body began to. "I don't want to go alone. Not like this." Maya's heart constricted. This was the part of the job that no training prepared you for. The crushing weight of a life's regrets settling in the final hours. "You're not alone, Frank. I'm here. We're all here for you." He gave a weak, dismissive shake of his head. The effort was immense. "It's not the same." His gaze drifted back to the photo. "A man needs his son." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken grief. Then came the request, so quiet Maya had to lean in to hear it, a whisper that would change everything. "Will you find someone?" He breathed, his eyes pleading. "Anyone. A young man, strong. Ask him if he'll pretend, just for one day, to be my son." The air left Maya's lungs. Of all the last requests she had heard, for a favorite meal, a long-lost song, a final look at the sunset, this was the most heart-wrenching. He wasn't asking for a memory, he was asking for a fiction, a stand-in for a love that was absent. He wanted to borrow a son to see him off. "Frank," she started, the professional part of her brain scrambling for a gentle refusal, a way to manage expectations. It was impossible, unethical, a fantasy. But the look in his eyes wasn't asking a nurse. It was a dying father making a final plea. He saw the hesitation on her face, and a flicker of his old spirit surfaced. "I was a good soldier," he rasped, "fought for this country. But I wasn't a good father. Maybe I don't deserve it, but I'm asking anyway." His trembling hand fell back to the blanket, the effort too much. He closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the weathered landscape of his cheek. The request hung in the air, a fragile, impossible hope. For the next 2 days, Maya was haunted. Every time she entered Frank's room, she saw the unspoken question in his eyes. He didn't ask again. He didn't have to. The silence was louder than words. She watched him fade, his moments of lucidity becoming shorter, the spaces between breaths growing longer. The doctors gave him a week, maybe less. The clock was ticking, not just on his life, but on his last wish. She'd called the number for his son again, the one listed in the emergency contacts. It went to a curt voicemail message. She left another message, her voice carefully neutral, professional. "This is Maya from St. Jude's Hospice. We believe it's important you know your father's condition is declining." The call was never returned. She felt a cold anger toward the man in the photograph, this Mark who could so easily discard his father. But she also felt a growing, terrifying sense of responsibility. Frank had asked her. He had put his last hope in her hands. To do nothing felt like a betrayal worse than Mark's absence. It felt like agreeing that he deserved to die alone. On the third day during her lunch break, she sat in her car, unable to eat. The hospice was on the edge of town, bordering a semi-industrial area of warehouses and long flat roads. It was then that she heard it, a low guttural rumble that grew into a ground-shaking thunder. A procession of motorcycles roared past, a river of chrome and black leather. They pulled into the lot of a gritty diner across the street, a place called Sarge's. She watched them dismount. They were big men, bearded and imposing, their vests covered in patches she didn't understand. They moved with a quiet, confident authority, a brotherhood forged on the open road. They looked dangerous. They looked like everything she was supposed to avoid. And yet an idea, insane and desperate, began to form in her mind. Frank had asked for someone strong. These men were strong. They looked like they feared nothing. But was there kindness beneath the leather? Was there compassion behind the intimidating scowls? It was a crazy, career-ending, utterly unprofessional thought. But the image of Frank's pleading eyes was burned into her mind. He wasn't asking for a saint. He was asking for a son who was strong, a son who would show up. Have you ever seen someone in need and felt that pull to do something, even if it scared you? That voice in your gut that tells you the rules don't matter as much as the person right in front of you. Let us know in the comments below, because what Maya did next took more courage than she ever thought she had. She put her uneaten sandwich down, took a deep breath that did little to calm her hammering heart, and got out of the car. Her sensible nursing shoes felt flimsy and inadequate as she crossed the asphalt toward the lion's den. Every step was a battle between her training and her conscience. The rumble of the bikes had subsided, but the air still vibrated with their power. The diner door opened with a jingle of a small bell, a sound far too cheerful for the scene inside. The place fell silent. Every head turned. The bikers, settled into booths and at the counter, stared at her. Maya, in her pale blue scrubs, felt like a lamb that had wandered into a wolf pack. Their eyes weren't hostile, but they were intensely curious, guarded. Her gaze scanned the room looking for a leader. She found him in the back booth. He was older than the others, his beard more gray than black, braided with small silver rings. His face was a roadmap of hard miles and harder fights. A prominent patch on his leather vest read, "President." He wasn't looking at her. He was slowly stirring a cup of coffee, his movements deliberate, patient. He knew she was there. He was waiting. Maya's throat was dry. She walked toward his booth, her footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. She felt a dozen pairs of eyes on her back. When she reached his table, he finally looked up. His eyes were a startlingly pale blue, chips of ice that seemed to see right through her. "Can I help you?" His voice was a low gravel, like stones tumbling downhill. She clutched the strap of her purse, her knuckles white. "My name is Maya. I'm a nurse at the hospice across the street." He gave a slow, deliberate nod. He didn't invite her to sit. He just waited. The man next to him, larger and younger, glared at her with open suspicion. "I have a patient," Maya began, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "His name is Frank. He's a veteran. Army. He's dying." The president's expression didn't change, but she saw something shift in his eyes. A flicker of interest. The word veteran had landed. "He has a son," she continued, forcing the words out. "But his son won't come. Frank's last wish, it's to see his son one more time, but he knows it won't happen." She took a ragged breath, the absurdity of what she was about to ask crashing down on her. "So he asked me to find someone to pretend." The silence in the diner was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. The biker beside the president snorted in disbelief, but the president just kept his icy gaze on her. "Pretend to be his son?" Maya nodded, feeling a flush of heat rise in her cheeks. "Just for a day or an hour. Just so he doesn't have to die feeling like he was forgotten. He said he wanted someone strong." Her eyes met his. "I saw you and your men pull in, and I thought I had to ask." She had said it. The insane request was out in the open. She expected to be laughed at, to be told to get lost, to be dismissed as a crazy woman. She braced herself for the humiliation. The president leaned back in his booth, his gaze never leaving her face. He studied her for a long, agonizing moment. He seemed to be weighing her, measuring her sincerity, her desperation. He picked up his coffee cup, took a slow sip, and placed it back in the saucer with a soft click. The sound was like a gavel falling. "What's your name again?" he asked, his voice still a low rumble. "Maya. And this man, Frank. Army, you said?" "Yes, he served in Korea." The president exchanged a look with the man beside him, a silent, unreadable communication. He then looked around the diner, his gaze sweeping over his men. Every one of them was watching, waiting for his signal. Finally, his pale blue eyes returned to Maya. "We're not actors, little nurse." Her heart sank. "I know. I'm sorry to have bothered you." She started to turn away, the shame and disappointment washing over her. "I didn't say no." The words stopped her cold. She turned back, her eyes wide with disbelief. He motioned to the empty seat opposite him. "Sit down, Maya. Tell me about Frank." For the next 20 minutes, as the other bikers slowly resumed their quiet conversations, Maya told him everything. She told him about the photograph, the trembling hands, the whispered confession of being a bad father. She spoke of Frank's pride in his service and his deep, abiding loneliness. She didn't cry, but her voice was thick with an emotion she couldn't hide. The biker president listened without interruption. He just nodded occasionally, his gaze fixed on a point beyond her shoulder, as if he were seeing the story play out. When she finished, he was silent for another long moment. "My road name is Preacher," he said finally. "This is my club, the Forsaken Sons." He gestured around the room. "Most of us are vets, Army, Marines. We look out for our own." He leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table. The sheer size of him was intimidating, but his eyes had lost their icy edge. They were now filled with a solemn gravity. "A man shouldn't die alone," Preacher said, as if it were the most fundamental law of the universe. "Especially not a brother in arms." He looked at the man beside him. "Roadblock, get the details. Room number, visiting hours." Roadblock, the man who had been glaring at her, pulled out a small notebook and a pen, his expression now one of grudging respect. Preacher turned his attention back to Maya. "One of my boys will be there tomorrow, 10 a.m. He'll be strong. He'll be respectful. He'll be the son your man needs for the day." Relief washed over Maya so intensely her knees felt weak. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate. "I don't know how to thank you." Preacher just gave a single curt nod. "No thanks needed. You had the courage to walk in here and ask. That's enough." He looked past her, toward the door. "Now go on back to your patient. Tell him his son is on his way." The next morning, a nervous energy filled Maya's entire being. She told Frank that she had reached his son, a small lie to pave the way for a greater truth. "He's coming today, Frank," she'd said, her voice bright. "Around 10. A light she hadn't seen in weeks flickered in Frank's eyes. He had struggled to sit up a little straighter, had asked her to help him shave. It was the most life he'd shown since arriving. Now she just prayed the biker would show. What if Preacher had changed his mind? What if it was all a joke? At 9:55 a.m. she heard it. It started as a distant hum, a vibration she felt in the soles of her shoes before she could place the sound. It grew steadily, a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to be coming from the earth itself. Other nurses paused in the hallway, looking out the windows. Patients who were able stirred in their beds. The hum became a roar. It wasn't one engine. It was dozens. It was 100. Maya rushed to Frank's window, her heart pounding against her ribs. What she saw stole her breath. The road leading to the hospice was filled, curb to curb, with motorcycles. They weren't just a group. They were an army. They poured into the parking lot, a slow, disciplined, thundering procession of chrome and steel. They parked in perfect, neat rows, filling every available space, their engines idling in a synchronized, deafening chorus. At the head of the formation was Preacher, his pale eyes scanning the building. Beside him was Roadblock. Behind them were men of all ages, all shapes, all sizes, their leather vests a uniform of solidarity. They weren't 10 or 20. Maya tried to count but lost track. There had to be over 100. A single unified motion rippled through the ranks. One by one, they cut their engines. The sudden, profound silence was more powerful than the noise had been. In his bed, Frank's eyes were wide with confusion and awe. He could feel the vibration through the floor. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Maya's own voice was choked with emotion. She turned from the window, her face beaming. "Frank," she said, her voice breaking. "Your son. He brought some friends." Preacher dismounted, followed by the rest of the club. They didn't storm the entrance. They stood by their bikes, a silent, respectful legion, waiting. Preacher walked to the main door, where the hospice director, a woman named Mrs. Gable, stood with her mouth agape. "I'm here to see Frank," Preacher said, his voice calm but firm. "We were told he was expecting his son." Mrs. Gable, usually a stickler for rules, was rendered speechless. She just nodded and pointed down the hall. Preacher entered alone, his boots making heavy, deliberate sounds on the pristine floor. He stopped at the door to Frank's room, removing his sunglasses. He looked at Maya, who gave him a watery, grateful nod. Then he turned his gaze to the frail old man in the bed. He walked to the bedside and stood there for a moment, a mountain of a man looking down at a wisp of a man. Frank stared up at him, his expression a mixture of fear and wonder. Preacher slowly, gently, knelt down on one knee, bringing himself eye level with Frank. The gesture was one of profound respect. "Dad?" Preacher said, his gravelly voice softened to a near whisper. "I'm here. I'm sorry it took me so long." The dam of Frank's composure broke. Decades of grief, regret, and loneliness poured out of him in a single shuddering sob. He reached out a trembling hand, and Preacher took it, his large, calloused fingers engulfing Frank's frail ones. "My boy," Frank wept. "My boy." For the next 8 hours, Frank was not a patient. He was a father, a commander, a king holding court. The bikers came in 2 by 2, a quiet, steady stream of sons paying their respects. They didn't crowd the room. They were patient, waiting their turn in the hallway, which they filled with their silent, protective presence. They didn't offer pity. They offered respect. They pulled up chairs and listened, truly listened, as Frank, energized by their presence, recounted stories from his time in Korea. He spoke of the cold, the fear, and the brotherhood. The bikers, many of them vets themselves, nodded in understanding. They knew the language of service. They shared stories of their own, of tours in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. In that small, sterile room, a sacred bond was forged between generations of warriors. Roadblock, the one who had seemed the most intimidating, turned out to have the gentlest touch. He helped Frank with his lunch, cutting his food into small pieces and making a dry joke about army rations that made Frank give a weak, wheezing laugh. Around 3 p.m., Preacher asked Maya a question. "Can he go outside? He needs to see the sun." It was against every rule. Frank was too weak, but Maya looked at the life in his eyes, a fire she thought had been extinguished forever. "Yes," she said, without checking with the doctor. "Yes, he can." They bundled Frank into a wheelchair. 4 of the largest bikers lifted it, chair and all, as if it weighed nothing, carrying him down the steps and out into the brilliant afternoon sun. They positioned him at the head of the parking lot, where he could see them all. 175 men, 175 motorcycles, a legion of leather-clad angels standing in silent tribute. Frank's eyes scanned the sea of faces looking back at him, and his own filled with a quiet, overwhelming gratitude. He was not forgotten. He was revered. Then Preacher did something more. He gestured to a bike with a sidecar. "He needs a ride," Preacher declared. "Just around the lot. He needs to feel the wind again." Carefully, they lifted Frank from his wheelchair and settled him into the sidecar. Preacher himself got on the bike. He didn't start the engine. He turned to the crowd and held up a hand. In perfect unison, every single biker started their engine. The sound was a deafening, glorious roar, a symphony of horsepower that shook the very foundations of the building. It wasn't a disruption, it was a salute. Preacher drove slowly, carefully, once around the parking lot. Frank, bundled in blankets, didn't look frail anymore. His head was held high, a small smile on his face, the wind gently stirring his thin white hair. For a few precious minutes, he wasn't a dying man in a hospice. He was a soldier on parade, receiving his final, magnificent honor. They brought him back inside as the sun began to set. He was exhausted, but his spirit was luminous. He held Preacher's hand and wouldn't let go. "Thank you," Frank whispered, his voice barely audible. "You're a good son." Preacher's jaw tightened, and he squeezed Frank's hand gently. "You rest now, Dad. We'll be right outside." And they were. They didn't leave. They set up a quiet vigil in the hallway in the parking lot. They drank coffee and spoke in low tones, their presence a protective shield around the room. Maya finished her shift, but she couldn't bring herself to leave either. She sat in a chair in the corner of Frank's room, keeping watch with Preacher. Sometime after midnight, Frank's breathing grew shallow, then softer, then stopped. He passed peacefully in his sleep, a faint smile on his lips. He had not died alone. He had died a father, surrounded by his sons. The story of that day could have ended there, but it didn't. The forsaken sons didn't just show up for Frank's last day, they showed up for his funeral. All 175 of them escorted the hearse to the veterans' cemetery, a thundering honor guard that brought traffic to a standstill. At the graveside, preacher stood before the small casket. He didn't read a eulogy. He simply placed a worn leather glove on the wood. "Ride free, brother," he said. And one by one, his men filed past, each leaving a single red rose. There was no estranged son named Mark in sight, but Frank had more family in death than he'd ever had in his last years of life. In the weeks that followed, the hospice changed. The bikers didn't disappear. They had, in a sense, adopted the place. They showed up on weekends to mow the lawn and fix a leaky roof. They started a fund to help patients who didn't have family to cover small expenses. Roadblock the Giant came every Tuesday to read to a blind woman who loved Westerns. Preacher and Maya became unlikely friends, bonded by the secret they shared. They'd meet for coffee at Sarge's diner, and he'd tell her stories of the men she had brought into her world. They weren't criminals or outcasts. They were welders, mechanics, and retired soldiers who had built a family out of loyalty and respect. A family that had room for a lonely old man. Years passed. The story of Frank's last ride became a club legend, a defining moment that reminded them of their true purpose. It wasn't about being tough. It was about being there. Maya eventually left the hospice for a teaching position at a nursing school, where she told every graduating class the story of Frank and the bikers. She taught them that sometimes the most important part of care has nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with listening. The ripples of that one day of one nurse's desperate, courageous act spread wider than anyone could have imagined. It changed a motorcycle club. It changed a hospice. It changed the lives of hundreds of patients who came after Frank, who now never had to face their final days alone. It all started with a quiet question, a tremor in a hand, and the choice to listen to a dying man's last wish. It's a powerful reminder that heroes don't always wear capes or uniforms. Sometimes they wear scrubs, and sometimes they ride in on wings of chrome and steel. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the angels who walk among us. Family isn't always the one you're born into. It's the people who show up when you need them most. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded of that truth. And tell us in the comments, who are the unexpected angels in your life?